Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're tackling perhaps the most terrifying and consequential question of the 20th century, how the Cold War almost turned nuclear. It's a question that, on the surface, seems paradoxical. Two great superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, understood that a full-scale nuclear exchange meant mutually assured destruction, or MAD, yet for over 4 decades, we live perpetually on the brink. The history of the Cold War is filled with political standoffs, proxy wars, and espionage, but the most chilling stories are those of the moments, the mistakes, the miscalculations, the technical glitches that nearly pushed the entire world over the nuclear cliff. We're talking about situations where the difference between life and global annihilation was measured not in days, but in minutes, sometimes even seconds. Today, we're diving deep into these horrifying near misses, moving beyond the familiar political narrative to explore the technological, logistical, and human failures that brought us to the edge. This is the story of the thin thread of sanity that saved humanity, and to tell it accurately and thoroughly, I've relied on the exceptional work of leading historians and journalists. We'll be drawing heavily from Michael Dobbs' *1 Minute to Midnight* for its definitive, moment-by-moment account of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Eric Schlosser's *Command and Control*, which meticulously details the terrifying fragility of the nuclear arsenal and the accidents that almost destroyed major U.S. cities. David E. Hoffman's *The Dead Hand*, a crucial work that uncovers the Soviet side of the arms race, including their terrifying automated retaliation system, and John Lewis Gaddis' *The Cold War*, a new history for the grand strategic context that framed these dangers. Our deep dive will explore 4 major crises and the crucial role of the unsung heroes, the military officers who chose to disobey orders and save the world. By the end of this hour-long video, you'll have a much clearer and perhaps more frightening understanding of how the Cold War almost turned nuclear. Crisis 1. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The world on a knife edge. Our journey into the nuclear abyss must begin with the most famous, and certainly the most perilous, confrontation of the entire Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. As John Lewis Gaddis notes in *The Cold War, a new history*, this was the only time in the nuclear age when direct contact was made between Soviet and American military forces, with both sides fully armed and on high alert. The crisis began with the startling discovery by US U-2 spy planes that the Soviet Union was installing intermediate-range ballistic missiles (IRBMs) and medium-range ballistic missiles (MRBMs) in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. This move, orchestrated by Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, was a daring, desperate gamble. From the Soviet perspective, it was meant to offset the strategic imbalance created by US Jupiter missiles in Turkey and to protect the new communist ally, Cuba, from further invasion attempts. From the American perspective, led by President John F. Kennedy, the missiles drastically shortened the warning time for a nuclear attack, fundamentally altering the strategic equilibrium and representing an unacceptable threat to national security. As Michael Dobbs details in *1 Minute to Midnight, the world was truly held hostage for 13 harrowing days. Kennedy formed an advisory group, XCOM, which immediately divided between those who favored a swift, decisive military strike and air attack followed by an invasion, and those who favored a more cautious, diplomatic approach and naval quarantine. The military option carried an almost certain risk of escalating to nuclear war, as Soviet troops were already on the island. The eventual decision was the naval quarantine, a blockade of Cuba to prevent more offensive weapons from reaching the island. This was a critical test of will, where any misstep could have been catastrophic. On October 24th, Soviet ships approached the line of the quarantine, only to turn back at the last moment, a moment of profound tension. But the real danger was hidden, occurring not in the glare of the White House or the Kremlin, but in the deep, opaque waters of the Atlantic. Unknown to the Americans, the Soviets had 4 Foxtrot-class attack submarines, the B-59, B-130, B-36, and B-4, operating near Cuba, each armed with a T-5 nuclear torpedo, a weapon with the explosive power of the Hiroshima bomb, and critically, a weapon whose use could be authorized by the submarine's 3 senior officers, the captain, the political officer, and the executive officer. The U.S. Navy, unaware of the nuclear payload, relentlessly harassed the submarines, dropping practice depth charges, small explosives meant to force the sub to the surface. The crew of the Soviet submarine B-59, under Captain Valentin Savitsky, was suffering immensely from extreme heat, high carbon dioxide levels, and deep stress. On October 27th, Battered by the American explosives and convinced that war had already begun, Savitsky, the captain, and the political officer Ivan Semenovich Maslenikov agreed to fire the T-5 nuclear torpedo at the American destroyer USS Beale *. Only the intervention of the second-in-command executive officer Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov, who alone insisted that all three must agree and who calmly argued for surfacing to confirm war status, prevented the launch. As Dobbs, drawing on declassified transcripts and interviews, highlights, Arkhipov's single act of refusal in a dark, claustrophobic 2,000 feet beneath the waves was the greatest single act of courage and de-escalation of the entire crisis, a moment that truly answers how the Cold War almost turned nuclear. The other close calls during the crisis were numerous. A U-2 spy plane strayed into Soviet airspace near Chukotka and was nearly shot down by Soviet MiGs, triggering an alert response from American B-52s, and Soviet forces in Cuba were already authorized to use tactical nuclear weapons against an invading U.S. force, a critical piece of intelligence unknown to Kennedy until years later. The world was truly saved not by brilliant planning, but by the cautious restraint of men like Arkhipov and the fortunate back-channel diplomacy that finally led Khrushchev to agree to remove the missiles in exchange for a public U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and a secret agreement to remove the U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis serves as the starkest reminder of the fragility of peace, confirming Gaddis' assertion that it was the greatest close call in human history. Crisis 2: Technological Failures and the Dead Hand System. While the Cuban Missile Crisis showcased the terrifying potential for human misjudgment, the decades that followed were equally, if not more, dangerous due to a different threat: technological error. The sheer complexity of command and control systems for thousands of nuclear weapons ICBM, SLBM, bombers, and cruise missiles created an environment where a single component failure could have doomed the planet. Eric Schlosser's Command and Control provides a chilling, detailed look into this world of accidental near misses and technological frailties. Schlosser documents numerous instances where human error, software glitches, or equipment malfunctions resulted in false alarms and near-catastrophic accidents, which repeatedly brought the U.S. and the Soviets to the brink. One of the most terrifying U.S. incidents occurred in November 1979 at the NORAD North American Aerospace Defense Command headquarters. A training tape simulating a full-scale Soviet nuclear attack with 2,200 incoming missiles was accidentally loaded into the operational computer system. For 6 terrifying minutes, military officials believed a real attack was underway. Fighters were scrambled, airborne command posts took off, and missile crews were placed on the highest alert. Only the quick thinking and the strict procedural adherence of the watch team, who verified the lack of warnings from other systems and ground radar, prevented a full-scale retaliation launch. This incident was alarmingly close to prompting the Strategic Air Command SAC to launch B-52 bombers toward their fail-safe points over the Arctic, ready to proceed toward the Soviet Union on command. Another similar, near-fatal incident occurred in June 1980 when a malfunctioning 46-cent microchip in a communications multiplexer falsely indicated that 2 missile-launching submarines were about to fire their nuclear payloads. The sheer scale of the U.S. nuclear arsenal meant that, as Schlosser demonstrates, accidental launches and handling incidents were frighteningly common. For instance, the Goldsboro B-52 crash in 1961 saw 2 Mark 39 thermonuclear bombs jettison over North Carolina. One bomb's parachute deployed and was recovered safely, but the other, which carried a mass of 4 mega and yield 260 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb, impacted the ground. Critically, Schlosser reveals that 5 of the 6 safety mechanisms on that bomb failed, and only a single low-voltage switch, a final fail-safe, prevented a detonation that would have decimated the eastern seaboard of the United States. This demonstrates the terrifying reality that the illusion of control was far more comforting than the reality of safety. Across the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union faced similar, if more opaque, dangers. David E. Hoffman's The Dead Hand reveals the Soviet efforts to secure a second strike capability, leading to the development of the ultimate technological failsafe, the perimeter system, chillingly nicknamed the Dead Hand or Mertbeer Ruka. This was a fully automated, doomsday system designed to launch a retaliatory nuclear strike against the West even if the entire Soviet leadership had been wiped out by a first strike. The system, conceived by figures like Colonel General V.I. Gerasimov and later refined, was essentially a network of seismic, light, and radiation sensors along with internal military communications checks designed to verify that a nuclear attack had occurred and that command centers were destroyed. If these conditions were met, a special command rocket would be launched, transmitting launch codes to surviving ICBM silos and submarines, initiating a full, automated retaliation. Hoffman describes how this system, a truly terrifying example of technological escalation, was ready to go operational in the early 1980s, ensuring that even decapitation would not save the West. The dead hand represented the ultimate loss of human control, placing the fate of the world in the hands of an algorithm. This move was a direct response to U.S. advances in targeting and missile accuracy, and it fundamentally altered the strategic landscape, ensuring that even during periods of détente, the threat of an accidental, automated nuclear war remained, providing a stark answer to how the Cold War almost turned nuclear due to reliance on fallible technology. Crisis 3, the 1983 Able Archer Scare, Misperception, and Near War. By the early 1980s, the rhetoric between the US and the USSR had dangerously hardened. President Ronald Reagan had dubbed the Soviet Union the evil empire and initiated the Strategic Defense Initiative (SDI), mockingly called Star Wars, and deployed new Pershing Roman II missiles in Europe. Tensions were sky high, and it was in this atmosphere of profound distrust that the world experienced arguably its most dangerous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis, a moment of profound misperception and near war known as the 1983 Able Archer Scare. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization (NATO) regularly conducted military exercises, and Able Archer 83 was a massive, realistic command post exercise scheduled for November 1983. It involved senior leaders from NATO countries, simulating a progression from conventional war to chemical, and finally, to nuclear war, including simulated high-level releases of nuclear strike orders. John Lewis Gaddis notes that the Soviet leadership, then under Yuri Andropov, was deeply paranoid and fundamentally convinced that the US was not merely planning for war, but was actively preparing to launch a surprise, devastating first strike. Soviet intelligence, particularly the KGB, ran a covert operation called Ryan from *Raketny Ядерной Napadenie*, or nuclear missile attack, dedicated to finding any signs of a surprise attack preparation. The 1983 exercise, however, incorporated several new elements that the Soviets interpreted not as training, but as actual mobilization for war. These new, highly realistic elements included the participation of heads of state including Vice President George H.W. Bush, the use of unique, encrypted communications methods, and the radio silence and movement of troops in high alert postures across Europe, which mirrored actual mobilization plans. David E. Hoffman's The Dead Hand details how the Soviets reacted. They believed that a genuine first strike would be masked by a large-scale exercise to catch them off guard. Soviet forces were quietly placed on high alert. Reconnaissance flights were increased. Nuclear-capable aircraft in East Germany and Poland were loaded with live nuclear weapons and put on runway alert, and the readiness of ICBM forces was significantly raised. The Soviet military command genuinely believed that the US was setting the stage for war. Compounding this terrifying situation, a critical near-miss had occurred just 2 months earlier on September 26, 1983, when Soviet Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, the duty officer at the Soviet Early Warning Center Serpukhov-15, received warnings that the U.S. had launched 5 ICBM toward the USSR. The new Soviet satellite system had mistaken sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds for missile launches. Petrov, trusting his instincts and noting the implausibility of the U.S. launching only 5 missiles, a full strike would involve hundreds, decided that the warning was a system error and refused to report it up the chain of command, a decision which almost certainly averted a retaliatory strike as Soviet doctrine mandated an immediate, massive response to confirmed attack. This was a human fail-safe that saved the world. Then came Able Archer. When the exercise went live in November, the Soviets were already primed for paranoia. They saw the increase in alert status within the exercise not as a drill step, but as a real-world warning. It took the intervention of cooler heads in Western intelligence, particularly within the CIA, who analyzed the Soviet reaction and realized the dangerous misinterpretation, to prompt Western leaders to scale back the intensity of the fatal phases of the exercise. The revelation that the US and NATO training exercise was perceived as a real, imminent threat by the Soviets underscores the razor-thin margin for error inherent in the concept of deterrence. Gaddis highlights that this crisis was uniquely dangerous because it was born out of profound misperception, a situation where one side's defensive preparations were interpreted by the other as offensive mobilization. It was a crisis not of intent, but of signals, and it proved that the human element, both in the form of Petrov's refusal to panic and the belated realization of the danger by U.S. intelligence, was the only thing preventing nuclear war, giving a terrifying answer to how the Cold War almost turned nuclear through a failure of communication and empathy. Crisis 4. The Far East flare-ups, war scares in the periphery. Beyond the major flashpoints of Cuba and Central Europe, the Cold War's nuclear brinkmanship was often played out in the periphery, particularly in the skies and seas of the Far East, where incidents could quickly spiral out of control due to the proximity of forces and the lack of established communication protocols. The early years of the arms race, before the sophistication of modern radar and satellite surveillance, were filled with terrifying near misses that often involved strategic bombers and hair-trigger alerts. Eric Schlosser recounts the persistent dangers posed by U.S. Strategic Air Command SAC bombers, which for decades flew missions carrying live nuclear weapons, often cruising close to the Soviet borders. The famous Broken Arrow incident accidents involving nuclear weapons were far more numerous and serious than the public knew. The 1968 crash of a B-52 bomber near Thule Air Base in Greenland, which scattered radioactive material after the conventional explosives in its 4 hydrogen bombs detonated on impact, demonstrated the risk of simply carrying these weapons, let alone using them. The sheer volume of accidental drops and near detonations underscores the systemic danger inherent in maintaining a ready nuclear force. Furthermore, the geopolitical conflicts in Asia frequently served as proxy flashpoints that threatened to escalate to nuclear war. The Korean War 1950-1953 saw serious consideration by the Truman and Eisenhower administrations of using nuclear weapons against North Korea or China to break the bloody stalemate. While ultimately rejected, the mere discussion highlighted the willingness of leaders to cross the nuclear threshold in a conventional conflict that had stalled. The Taiwan Strait crises in the 1950s also saw the U.S. make veiled nuclear threats to deter Chinese communist aggression against Taiwan, a policy known as massive retaliation. But perhaps the most enduring and underappreciated threat from the Far East in the late Cold War was the vulnerability of U.S. and Soviet assets to regional conflicts and miscalculation. The 1983 shootdown of Korean Airlines Flight 007 KAL-007 by a Soviet interceptor provides a chilling example of how tensions in the periphery could trigger a strategic alert. The passenger jet, carrying 269 people, had strayed into sensitive Soviet airspace near Sakhalin Island. The Soviet military, already on edge due to the Able Archer preparations and believing the aircraft was a U.S. spy plane, shot it down. Hoffman describes the immediate, intense fear in Moscow that the U.S. might retaliate militarily or escalate the confrontation. While the incident remained conventional, it created a massive spike in U.S.-Soviet tensions and placed military forces globally on heightened alert, demonstrating how a simple, tragic navigational error could ignite a crisis. This was compounded by the fact that the Soviets often used tactical nuclear weapons as a core part of their regional defense strategy, meaning any conventional conflict in places like the Sino-Soviet border or the Korean Peninsula carried an almost immediate risk of nuclear escalation. The presence of nuclear warheads on short-range missiles and artillery shells made the nuclear threshold alarmingly low in these peripheral theaters. The pervasive use of nuclear signaling and the constant high alert status of forces in Asia ensured that the dangers of miscalculation and accidental war were not just a European or Cuban phenomenon, but a constant, global reality, reinforcing the terrifying answer to how the Cold War almost turned nuclear through regional flare-ups and mistaken identity in the fog of proxy war. The human element, fail-safes, and the men who said no. Ultimately, for all the technological complexities, strategic doctrine, and geopolitical tensions, the story of how the Cold War avoided nuclear war is a story of human judgment, restraint, and dissent. The existence of fail-safe procedures, both technological and bureaucratic, were what prevented accidents from becoming catastrophes. Eric Schlosser's Command and Control devotes significant attention to the concept of permissive action links PALs, which were electromechanical locks on U.S. nuclear weapons designed to prevent unauthorized detonation. These locks required a secret code before the weapon could be armed. Schlosser reveals that for years, many U.S. weapons did not have PALs, and on those that did, The code was often set to 00000000 to allow for rapid deployment in the event of an attack, a terrifying acknowledgement of the priority given to speed over safety. However, the true, reliable fail-safe often rested not in circuitry, but in the conscience of individuals. We've already discussed the pivotal role of Soviet executive officer Vasily Arkhipov during the Cuban Missile Crisis, who alone prevented the launch of a nuclear torpedo. Arkhipov's adherence to procedure and, more importantly, his personal commitment to de-escalation saved millions of lives. But he was not alone. The equally critical role played by Soviet Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov in September 1983, when he dismissed a computer-generated warning of a U.S. ICBM attack as a system malfunction, is another towering example. Petrov literally saved the world by using logic and doubt in the face of machine certainty, a true act of moral courage that superseded official duty. David E. Hoffman details other instances where Soviet military personnel, often operating under immense pressure and secrecy, chose to follow procedure over panic. The Soviets, too, had their own multi-layered authorization system, and the deep-seated understanding of the MAD concept permeated the ranks, acting as a final, psychological check on the use of force. On the American side, the rigorous training and protocols of the U.S. Air Force and Navy were designed to create multiple layers of authorization. Schlosser documents the enormous number of checks and procedural hurdles that had to be overcome for a weapon to be moved, armed, or launched, a bureaucracy born of the knowledge that a mistake was an existential threat. The concept of negative control preventing the unauthorized use of nuclear weapons was often prioritized over positive control ensuring they could be used instantly. This emphasis on preventing accidental war was a mature, if slow, realization of the ultimate danger. Even political leaders, such as President Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, recognized the imperative to avoid giving the military a pre-delegation authority to launch weapons, choosing instead to keep the final decision squarely in civilian hands, demonstrating a critical shift in the understanding of ultimate authority. The willingness of individuals, often junior officers, to question their orders or doubt the certainty of their machines, thereby rejecting the launch cycle, underscores a profound truth. The ultimate fail-safe in the nuclear age was, and remains, humanity itself, the capacity for moral reasoning in the face of unparalleled destructive power, providing a most reassuring yet most precarious answer to how the Cold War almost turned nuclear but didn't. Conclusion: the unavoidable danger and its legacy. Our deep dive into how the Cold War almost turned nuclear has revealed a history far more terrifying than the public narrative often suggests. It was not merely a political chess match, it was a decades-long game of Russian roulette played with the entire world. The moments of near catastrophe, the deep-sea confrontation of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Dobbs, the terrifying succession of technological failures and accidental detonations across the U.S. nuclear complex, Schlosser, the existential dread of the Soviet dead hand and automated retaliation, Hoffman, and the terrifying geopolitical misperception of the Able Archer 83 exercise, Gaddis, demonstrate that the world survived not through foolproof control, but through incredible luck and the individual bravery of a few. The legacy of the Cold War's nuclear brinkmanship is one of permanent, unavoidable danger. The thousands of warheads remain, albeit reduced in number, and the complexity of command and control systems remains vulnerable to cyber attack, misinterpretation, and human error. The events we have detailed, drawn from the meticulous research of these acclaimed authors, serve as a stark warning. The nuclear clock is never truly set back to a safe time. The story of the Cold War is not just about the defeat of communism, it is about the global realization that the technology of destruction had outpaced the capacity of humanity to perfectly manage it. The human element, both the source of the danger and the ultimate fail-safe, remains the final, fragile line of defense against global annihilation. The question is not if we will face another crisis, but when and whether the next generation of Arkhipovs and Petrovs will be in place to say no. Thank you so much for watching this extensive, sobering exploration of how close we came to the unthinkable. This topic demands a thorough examination, and I hope this video, informed by the brilliant works of Hoffman, Schlosser, Gaddis, and Dobbs, has provided that clarity. If this deep dive into the nuclear brinksmanship of the Cold War has given you a new perspective on history, please do me a favor. Hit that like button, share this video with fellow history enthusiasts, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Your support helps us continue to produce more in-depth content like this. I'm incredibly keen to hear your thoughts. Which of the four crises, Cuba, the technological failures, Able Archer, or the Far East flare-ups, do you find the most terrifying? and why? Drop your comments and questions down below. I read as many as I can, and I look forward to engaging in these crucial discussions with you all. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning. This is Facts of Wars, and I'll see you in the next video.